Secretary Chertoff was confirmed as the second head of the Department of Homeland Security in February 2005. Prior to that, he served as a judge on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. He became a judge after serving in the Justice Department after 9/11 as Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, where he was responsible for the Justice Department's response to tracking terrorists and cooperating with foreign governments in obviously a very different criminal division environment. In his private life, well, he's given so much of his career to the public sector, he was a partner at Latham & Watkins. I want to emphasize that Secretary Chertoff left a very successful career in the practice of law to join the Bush administration, first as Assistant Secretary General, and then, of course, as a judge. Now, many people would have stopped there. Being a judge, I think I can say this as a former law professor, being a judge on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals is a very nice life. You are serving your country in a very important way. You have life tenure, which is something we academics are particularly sensitive to. And he could well have stayed there. But instead, when President Bush asked him, he came back to Washington to serve as the Secretary of the Homeland Security at a time when it was very clear that this was one of the most challenging assignments in Washington, to merge as many different agencies as we have tried to merge in Homeland Security, and to take on an agency of that size early in its development is an enormous challenge. We're celebrating the 75th anniversary here, and if you've heard me already, we are celebrating in particular a commitment to government service. Anniversaries are often about celebrating the past, and we've been doing plenty of that, but they are also, of course, about making plans for the future. Our students are preparing for a world of a whole set of new challenges, of a government that will be reorganizing, of a world that is struggling, in many cases, to cope with a whole range of new threats. Secretary Chertoff has been on the front lines of that new world. I think it's fair to say that recently those front lines have probably felt a lot like the actual combat that General Petraeus was just telling us about. We are very grateful and pleased that he has agreed to come to us to give us a report from the front, and I am honored to welcome him as our closing speaker of the 75th anniversary.
Well, thank you, Anne-Marie, for that really gracious introduction. It is true we did talk about the possibility of my teaching. Had I agreed to do that, I would have had to bail out before the first class, which I think would have put you in a difficult spot. So maybe that worked out very well, but perhaps at some time in the future. It is really great to be here, though. This is a very distinguished group of people. The school is very distinguished. As you know, your dean is very distinguished and has written and spoken very thoughtfully about some of the challenges that we face in the international arena as we move into an epoch at this point in which the network of relationships that will cross national boundaries increasingly thickens, and we have essentially international institutions that arise not through the conventional ambassadorial routes or the big UN multilateral routes, but through a series of perhaps less visible but very important routes in the legal arena and in the economic arena. So you've got a very distinguished dean here, and I'm proud to be here to speak as I close this anniversary celebration. I also follow in some very difficult footsteps. I know my colleague Secretary Rice was here to kick off this discussion, and General Petraeus, who is, I know, very widely admired as a very thoughtful and skillful military leader, I know spoke to you earlier today. Of course, the Woodrow Wilson School is named after Woodrow Wilson, who was an a far-seeing and devoted student of the importance of America's role in the world, and an individual for whom America's purpose was very clear. I think his words were to discover and maintain liberty among men. The desire and respect for liberty, of course, binds us together as Americans, but it also binds together the free nations of the world, and in fact, I would venture to say binds together even those people who live in nations that are unfree. I agree with the President, who often says that we should never sell people short by assuming that they don't aspire to the freedom and the rule of law to which we aspire and which we cherish. I think time and again we've seen the desire for liberty and freedom and common humanity transcend geographic boundaries and unite our world. And I would say when people say it's not possible, that there are parts of the world that can't be free or that can't follow the rule of law, I have to go back to my experience or my recollection of being in high school and in college in the 60s and 70s, when the thought of the Berlin Wall coming down and Poland and Czechoslovakia, what was then Czechoslovakia, and Romania being free countries, was viewed as a pipe dream. And of course now we live in a world in which that is very much true. If we look at the changes, it really ought to inspire us not to have a short-sighted horizon, but a very long-range horizon, and to aspire to the greatest dreams that we can dream. But beyond the questions of liberty and freedom, there are a whole host of other ways in which our world is increasingly interdependent. We all remember when the tsunami struck Asia last December, taking hundreds of thousands of lives and destroying entire communities in the span of a few hours. Of course, that is a witness to the enormous power nature has when wind and water are thrust against what seem to us to be very sturdy communities. It's just awe-inspiring to see how nature wipes it away in one fell swoop. But in the wake of the tsunami, we also saw something that was very elevating, an unprecedented outpouring of generosity and support from many nations of the world, including a remarkable relief effort led by the United States. On the other hand, when Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita roared ashore last month, it devastated our own country. Large areas of the Gulf Coast were submerged either in the initial storm surge or in the subsequent flooding that occurred when levees broke in New Orleans. And then we saw an international response turned in our direction, and I think that was equally uplifting. More than 130 countries and over a dozen international organizations immediately offered vital aid, supplies, and personnel to the United States to support our recovery efforts. I had the privilege of speaking with a number of my counterparts from other countries, including England and Mexico and Germany, who were very, very quick to say not only did they offer their prayers and their hopes for our speedy recovery, but their resources and their personnel. We had the uplifting vision of Mexican military personnel actually crossing the border into the United States to assist in feeding the hungry. Dutch and German pumps were delivered to help us drain New Orleans. And Canadian officials actually delivered aid personally to the remnants that were in some afflicted communities. So as we continue to grapple with these unprecedented disasters and draw the necessary lessons from their aftermath, one thing is clear. In times of crisis, the international community does understand how to overlook its differences and act together to help fellow nations. These disasters also remind us that in a world of rapid globalization and increasing interdependence, some of our greatest challenges are not strictly or exclusively domestic in origin or in effect. In the 20th century, it was a commonplace to observe that the globalization of commerce, communications, financial systems, and transportation forced an entirely new set of alliances in the world. And we take those alliances for granted today because they're now part of the functioning of our global economy and the global exchange of ideas and information. But we are also witnessing today a globalization of threats and challenges that face countries in the world. And these are not only intentional man-made threats and challenges, but those that are natural as well. If you look at the news, you see the threat of international terrorism, perhaps most recently even this morning in Bali, potential pandemics like the avian flu, computer viruses, and even catastrophic natural events like hurricanes or tsunamis that can affect more than one country and have cascading effects on many more. All of these threats have in common the fact that they do not begin or end within a single geographic border or sovereign country. And no country acting alone can effectively shield itself from the dangers posed by these kinds of threats and challenges. Many of you may remember the power outages a few years ago that affected the northeastern part of the country. If you happened to be in Canada on that day, you'd remember that Canada lost power as well because Canada shares the same electrical grid in part with the United States. So it's this kind of interdependency that requires increasingly that we focus on common strategies and common systems of protection. Of course, terrorism is a particular example of that. We learned this in our own country on 9/11. We've seen it in Madrid, Bali, London, Egypt, Israel, and many other corners of the world since then. Terrorism is a scourge that is felt globally and has to be addressed globally. To protect ourselves against those who want to stamp out liberty and freedom and want to plunge the world into an ideology of intolerance, we have to operate through a new level of commitment and cooperation among members of the international community. And actually, since 9/11, we've accomplished a great deal doing just that, working with our international partners to identify and disrupt terrorist cells, dismantle terrorist organizations, and eliminate terrorist safe havens, all of which are essential to winning the war on terror. As the President has said repeatedly, our strategy must include fighting terrorism where it exists overseas, taking the war to the enemy, and bringing terrorists to justice before they can carry out attacks. But of course, we also have to have layers of defense against terrorism. And in all of this, we have to work together with our partners overseas. If we are going to arrive at a day when terrorism no longer casts a dark cloud over the civilized world, we have to be prepared to advance international cooperation to hitherto unseen heights. And that's because, of course, terrorism is also spreading its ideology of hatred and intolerance around the world, and we have to be able to match it in geographic location, point by point. The strategy has to be somewhat different than our traditional war-making strategy. We're not going to simply defeat terrorism by amassing superior forces in the field and then having a great set-to battle. The fact is, terrorists plan and raise funds and recruit operatives using a 21st century network style of organization that relies on many of the same systems and structures which drive our global commerce. And they're basically using our own positive tools as weapons against us. So these communications networks, financial services networks, transportation systems, and global supply chains become the very battlegrounds of the war against terror, because these are the critical nodes that bind us together and create our own positive networks. And therefore, we have to look at those networks, assess their vulnerabilities, see where terrorists are trying to exploit them, and respond in a international partnership in kind. We need, therefore, to cut off the terrorist communications. We need to isolate their financial resources, and we need to eliminate their transportation capabilities. And we need to do it in a way that does not interfere with or disrupt the positive benefits we continue to get from a globalized economy and the exchange of ideas, people, and services all around the world. So what is the Department of Homeland Security doing in this new kind of struggle against an ideology of intolerance? Well, over the past 2 years, the Department has been working very closely with international partners to pinpoint vulnerabilities in our common international network, plug the gaps in the network, and we're doing it in every area of intercourse around the world, whether it be container security, to biometrics that can be used to assess who's coming into the country and who's leaving the country, to secure travel documents, to making sure that our maritime and air domains remain free of terrorist activity. One example, through U.S. Visit, which is our system that gives us a capability to biometrically confirm the identity of all visitors at our port of entry using a simple fingerprint. We can now check people who are coming in real time, have their fingerprint electronically matched against the database, see if there are people who are, if their identity is in fact what the passport says, and then let the vast majority in the country with little more than a moment or two hesitation at the border. At the same time, U.S. Visit has proved again and again that we can use it to capture people, whether they are murderers, as happened a couple weeks ago, or terrorists, as has happened previously, who are coming in under a false identity, who pose a threat to our country, and who therefore we want to make sure are not allowed to enter and move freely. Similarly, in the maritime sector, we now have a container security initiative that actually allows our inspectors to work with our foreign counterparts to check cargo at the 20 busiest international ports overseas at the port of embarkation before that cargo ever loads on a ship and enters an American port. We've established new data sharing agreements with the European Union that allow us to electronically screen passengers on international flights even before they arrive in the United States. So that is putting our ability to screen and protect out ever further before people come in and place us at risk. And of course, we want to do this reciprocally. We want to afford our international partners the same ability to use our information to protect themselves as we ask them to provide us so we can protect ourselves. In fact, last week, I had the privilege of meeting with a delegation from the European Union to discuss how we can further use passenger name recognition information to meet our security goals and our privacy goals while creating the fewest possible inconveniences. One of the advantages of this, by the way, would be eliminating or drastically reducing the need for those flight diversions that you sometimes hear about on CNN when the plane's turned around because someone's gotten on the plane who was actually on a no-fly list or a potential terror suspect. All of these endeavors that DHS is undertaking recognize that we are part of a global network and that in order for the network to function, people and goods have to be able to move across borders rapidly, efficiently, and safely, but without sacrificing either security or personal privacy. The fact of the matter is, if you stand back, fundamentally we share the same belief as other nations do all around the world in the importance of personal privacy and civil liberties. To be sure, sometimes we differ a little bit in the precise way we apply those values in the individual context in which we live. I'll give you one example. In many countries in Europe, it's considered unremarkable that you're required to carry a personal identification card, that the police can stop you. If you don't have the card, you can be brought to the police station, you can be sanctioned. In other countries, such as in England, where they're debating the possibility of doing this, it's causing a considerable amount of controversy. On the other hand, there are things that we routinely do, or the British routinely do, in terms of access to phone records and telephone dialing records that are considered to be very, very controversial in continental Europe. The point is not that one society values privacy more than the other. We all, I think, value it a great deal. It is simply that our history and our culture tends to, in the application of this set of values, sometimes differ. And that, of course, creates a challenge within which we need to work, because we have to find a way to align our particular cultural and historical preferences so that we can work together efficiently and still at the same time all continue to commit ourselves to the fundamental values of liberty and privacy, which all of free societies hold very dear. Well, one way to do this is the use of technology and information screening. If we can screen effectively for information, we can actually be less intrusive in terms of what we do. And effective screening requires us to have two very important capabilities. First, we need to have the right kind of technology to screen dangerous people or dangerous things, while protecting sensitive information and minimizing delays and inconvenience. And second, we need to have the right kind of information and intelligence so we can quickly and accurately identify specific security risks. Both of these requirements necessitate that we and our partners overseas have sophisticated information gathering and information sharing capabilities and sophisticated tracking capabilities. And I'll give you a specific example. We worry a lot about containers coming into this country. There are millions coming in. If one were to inspect every single container, you would basically destroy global maritime trade, because the time it would take to move goods and services would make it utterly impractical. At the same time, we need to make sure something really bad doesn't come in. So the key is an intelligent use of screening in terms of information and data about what is in containers, greater visibility into the constituent pieces that wind up being put into a container before it's sealed. And with that kind of intelligence, we know where to target specifically the kinds of containers we do need to look into, either using technology that allows us to do a non-intrusive inspection, or even by opening the container and looking personally. So that's the kind of marriage of intelligent information gathering and screening technology that we need to use as we move forward internationally. And of course, it's obvious that when we build these systems, we cannot do so in isolation. We need information and vital technology from our international partners. Most important, we need to make sure we're building compatible systems and not creating additional vulnerabilities or inconveniences or security gaps because we're each pursuing separate kinds of systems. This is something that I've spoken at great length with my European counterparts about. You know, as we talk about systems to screen passengers, biometric passports, we need to make sure we have interoperable technologies. We want to make it easier and more convenient. And this requires a degree and intensity of international cooperation, which is frankly far greater than I think what we've experienced in previous decades. It's certainly far more than I envisioned when I first came into my current position. As we talk, of course, about international interdependence and cooperation, we should pay special attention to our own neighborhood here in North America, because nowhere is this more critical than with our neighbors to the north and to the south, Canada and Mexico. That's one of the reasons the President launched an initiative with the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Mexico called a Security and Prosperity Partnership. The purpose of this partnership is to recognize that we need to continue to endorse and encourage a vital trading partnership with Canada and Mexico, and at the same time we have to have a common playbook for managing security at our land borders, sharing intelligence, improving shared infrastructure, and all doing so without any cost to cross-border trade. Through this partnership, which we've been working on, and in which I've been involved personally, our countries have agreed to coordinate efforts in all of these areas, and we're already seeing some of the positive benefits this kind of alliance provides. We have a new trilateral trusted traveler program that will allow traveling between our countries to be yet easier and more secure for frequent border crossers. And we're doing the same thing with respect to cargo and trade as well. Lanes that allow reliable shippers to pass their cargo much more rapidly between countries so we can get the benefit of NAFTA and our other trading alliances. But I also would be remiss in talking about our neighbors if I didn't spend a moment talking about the particular challenge of illegal migration across the border, which I think is an issue of great sensitivity now in this country and in other countries as well. We have to acknowledge the fact that vast numbers of illegal migrants entering this country pose three challenges. There is a challenge to security. Some fraction of the people coming across are actually criminals or could be intending to do harm. There is a challenge to sovereignty. It seems to me one of the basic prerequisites of having a country and a national government is some ability to control one's own borders. And, of course, there's a big humanitarian dimension, because we see people being taken advantage of and exploited by organized criminal groups who bring them across the border. They can become victims of crime. They can be stranded in the desert. Sadly, every year in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, you hear of individuals who died because they were left alone. There was no water, there was no food. I will tell you that our Border Patrol agents put their own lives at risk, plunging into rivers and climbing down cliffs in order to rescue people who were stranded. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they do not. And that's why it's very important for us as we move forward to really begin to put the resources and the planning and the strategy in place to finally gain effective control of our border. A key piece of that, though, will be a recognition that without some legalized channel for temporary workers, as the President has said, you are putting an enormous tide of economic migration up against our ability to control the border, and that would make it very much more difficult. A successful strategy is a holistic strategy. It creates a channel for legal economic activity for temporary workers, which is something, of course, being very much debated now. And then with that channel, we reduce the pressure of illegal migration. We can then focus our resources on the things we're most concerned about. Finally, let me talk about one other issue. We, of course, want to be friends to the world. I mean, this is a university, and we want to attract the best and the brightest from all over the world, not only to share what they have to contribute, but so that we can share our values and create goodwill all over the world when people return home. In the wake of 9/11, I think we're acutely aware that both the reality and maybe to some larger extent the image of America as an unwelcoming country began to spread in some parts of the world. As I've spoken to Secretary Rice about it, I've spoken to the President about it, we're all committed to making sure the world views us as a welcome place for those who want to visit, who want to study, and ultimately for those who want to migrate and become American citizens. So that as we continue to make sure our security is being attended to, we need to be more streamlined and more effective in welcoming people. We've done this in the area of student visas. We're more, I think, user-friendly online. We want to continue to be moving in the direction of simplifying and lowering the burdens for those who want to come in this country in a way that doesn't sacrifice security, but in a way that both in reality and in our image tells the world, please come to the United States. We want to welcome you as our ancestors were welcomed in this country in generations past. We have seen a world that's come together to defeat tyranny in generations past, whether it was Nazi tyranny or whether it was tyranny more recently in the latter part of the 20th century. We've seen a world come together to defeat oppression in South Africa. We've seen a world come together to reduce human pain and suffering. As in the difficult trials in the past that we have confronted and surmounted, I'm convinced that together we can build the necessary alliances to confront our current international challenges: terrorism, pandemic disease, natural catastrophes, and that we will do so all the better if we work together internationally. I can tell you that we will work tirelessly toward this goal, and I'm confident that our partners and our allies will join us in doing so. I think the challenge for you all will be, as you enter, those of you who are students, as you enter the world, is to seize the ability to enlist in this great struggle and help us move forward so that we leave our children a legacy of success in the same way that our forebears left one to us. Thank you.
Secretary Chertoff has agreed to take questions. Wait for the microphone to come to you and identify you. Tom, there.
I know.
Thank you. Mike, you were involved in a constructive way.
You can just identify yourself.
I'm sorry, Tom Byrne, class of 76, undergraduate. Mike, you were involved in a constructive way in dealing with the racial profiling crisis in New Jersey some years ago. My question is, can you imagine any circumstances, such as in, say, trying to prevent another Madrid, where profiling would ever be appropriate in dealing with terrorism and national security?
Well, one thing we want to be careful to distinguish is between profiling that's based on specific characteristics we know about people who are a threat and profiling that's based on racial prejudice. The latter is not appropriate. We obviously do sometimes get information that there are people from a particular country, for example, who are coming in and might pose a threat, or people who might be, have certain physical characteristics or certain travel patterns, and it's obviously appropriate to pay attention to that. We also know that historically there were training camps in certain parts of the world. I don't think it's unreasonable to at least consider whether someone who was in Afghanistan for 4 months in a location where there's a training camp, one might want to consider that as a characteristic. But I do think that one of the dangers of letting prejudice guide these things, apart from the fact that it's wrong, is it's also misleading, because I can guarantee you that the enemy is anticipating our lapsing into some kind of a misguided approach, and they're looking for people who don't fit those stereotypes. So we would be dropping our guard if we were to do that. Now, obviously, at one extreme, a 1-year-old baby is not someone we're terribly worried about, although we sometimes need to worry about the parents. But the short answer is we should focus on characteristics that are meaningful characteristics in terms of what we want to prevent.
Up there in the, yes. You can wait for the microphone. We use this as a workout for various.
In the wake of 9/11...
You can just identify yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Susanna McLean, and I did not attend Princeton. My husband, Bill Zeller, was class of 84 at the Wilson School. In the wake of 9/11 and in the recognition of the intelligence failures preceding the Iraqi war, there was a great deal of pulling of hair and gnashing of teeth about the fact that we had precious little intelligence about the regions that we had to deal with in terrorism and in general discontent and hostility toward the United States. However, after 9/11, many of the communities of immigrants in the United States who may have been predisposed to help the U.S. government by providing information, by perhaps working for us abroad with their cultural and religious knowledge, their language skills, many of those communities felt very much harassed by the FBI, the INS, local law enforcement. And I'm wondering what, if anything, the government is doing to try to rebuild bridges and reestablish trust with those communities so that we can once again turn them to help us out.
Well, first of all, I didn't go to Princeton either, so we're in the same boat. I think very early on after 9/11, the president actually came out and was very explicit about the fact that we should not confuse the evil acts of a few people with the, a community at large. That, as with all communities, the Muslim community in America, the Jewish community, all communities, the vast majority of people are productive American citizens who want to continue to be productive. I recognize that there was, in the immediate period after 9/11, sometimes you had private people, you had acts of discrimination or acts of violence even against certain communities, and there's a lot of stuff that was said sometimes that by people that was not politic. We are working very hard to make sure those bridges are rebuilt. I know I've met with members from communities representing people who are in this country who have their roots in South Asia and the Middle East. I know Director Mueller has done so for the Bureau. I know other agencies have done so. There's no question that in order to get everything from language skill to cultural understanding to human intelligence, we need to enlist the full measure of resources in this country, and that means all communities. One of the things which I think this country actually is doing pretty well with is there's now an issue in Europe about, which we saw in part in London, about radicalization within certain communities that have basically been isolated and not been allowed to become part of the larger fabric of the country. And I'm asked sometimes, why do I think that has not yet happened here? And I think that while, this country certainly, as with everything else, we can always improve ourselves, we've been pretty good about being an open society and giving people the sense that when they come and they become part of this country, they have an opportunity to advance and to become, rise up and achieve anything. And I think that is one of the reasons that I think in our communities of all ethnic backgrounds, there is we have less of that sense of grievance and isolation, which I think is part of the radicalization of some people. We clearly need to continue to send the message that we don't want to have, I guess what they used to call hyphenated Americans treated differently. We all we are all Americans, we all want the same things, we all come from different backgrounds, and I will continue to send that message when I deal with communities. I know the Department of Justice does, I know the President does.
Yes, up there. I'm sorry, Dale, I'm choosing the furthest people.
We want to know what she did wrong.
Trying to have a diverse range of views here.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming. Greg Colson, I got a master's degree here in 1999. My question is in two parts, and it has to do with illegal immigration. When I was here, I did a study on illegal immigration and found that despite what the media would have us believe, in fact, the majority of illegal immigrants are visa overstayers. That is, people came under a different guise and actually stayed here beyond the scope of their original visa. So I'm wondering whether it isn't more appropriate to look at employer sanctions versus building higher fences on the border. And secondly, more institutionally, your recent IG report found that there's some dissension in the ranks about keeping immigration and customs enforcement separate from customs and border protection. And you had some issues with that. I'd just like to hear your views on that issue, whether all that shouldn't be brought under one roof so there'd be better coordination. Thank you.
Well, you are right that often when we talk about the challenge of illegal migration, the focus tends to be on the border rather than on overstays. And overstays are a significant part of the population of illegal migrants. One of the reasons I think the border issue tends to get attention is because there tends to be a particular impact on border communities. It's not spread out evenly, but people, trespassing, for example, it knocks down fences. It causes a certain amount of actual environmental damage, so that there's a disproportionate effect felt by border communities, and I also think, frankly, that's where the visuals are for the TV cameras. But we do have to look at the whole thing. I mean, the border is one piece of it. Employer enforcement is another piece of it. There's no question that the draw for most people is the marketplace. And employers seeking to fill jobs are therefore hiring people. Like with anything else, I think a strategy has to be a mix of things. One of the reasons that the President's talked about a temporary worker program is a recognition of the fact that there is a demand. If you can channel that demand into a legal, regulated environment where you set the terms of it, and then you've given it essentially a way forward for these employers, and hopefully what you then do is dry up the illegal market. As you do that, then the resources you need to enforce against those who don't want to take the legal route are much more effective because you have more resources to apply against a smaller number of people. On the issue of merging Customs and Border Protection and ICE, I testified about this a little bit maybe a month or two ago. You can always debate organizational issues. I will tell you that functionally, there is a difference between the function of dealing with the border issue and doing investigative activity. When you look at police departments, for example, there is a functional difference between police officers who are on patrol, who are first responders, and police officers who do detective investigation. That's not to say there isn't overlap, and that's not to say there doesn't have to be coordination, but generally speaking, a functional distinction is a sensible thing to reflect in organization. If one brought these two together, my sense is that they would remain separate anyway within the organization, so you'd simply be retitling. One thing that we have done is this, though. We did a review of the department, and we said, look, we need to have an ability to operate across all the operational components in a coordinated fashion. Not only Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, but Coast Guard, Secret Service. So we are in the process of building an operational element that would allow us to operate across all of our components, and a planning element that would allow us to plan across our components, which would actually, in some sense, be more coordination than the proposals to lump these two particular components together.
I will come right down here in the blue shirt.
I'm Ari. I'm a graduate student in computer science. I think there's pretty broad agreement that the disaster response to the recent Hurricane Katrina went pretty wrong. So, first of all, what in your view specifically went wrong? And then second, do you think the new department's, relatively new Department of Homeland Security's focus on terrorism detracted from its ability to respond to other kinds of disasters?
This is, there's not enough time to answer the first part of the question totally. I do want to emphasize one thing to people, though, and maybe if you haven't seen it, it's hard to envision the reality of this. This was, by any measure, I think the most challenging natural disaster ever confronted in this country, because it was a couple of disasters. You had an initial hurricane, which had it ended on Monday afternoon, would have, I think, surpassed virtually anything that had happened in this country before. Even in Mississippi alone, without getting to Louisiana, I think the damage and the toll exceeded that of prior hurricanes like Andrew and Ivan. And that was a huge challenge. But the second challenge was the break of the levee. The cause of that is debated. I saw a piece in the paper today that suggested the roots may lie in a dispute about the builders back in the mid-'90s who built that portion of the levee. They may have not done a proper job as a contracting matter, and we're talking about 15 years ago. That'll all get sorted out, but I will tell you the consequence of that was that when the levees broke and the city filled up overnight, you had a second distinct catastrophe, which then created a very, very difficult operational problem for people trying to evacuate people. Clearly, this is a physical challenge which under the best of circumstances is difficult to surmount. And there were challenges in terms of, for example, there's only a certain number of helicopters that can fly at a particular time because they will crash into each other. There's a limitation on the ability of helicopters to land because you have street poles and lights that interfere with the ability to land. So you had a very difficult task of rescuing people who were stranded, who hadn't left, maybe through no fault of their own, but who were stranded in houses. That was one challenge. There was a challenge of getting evacuations done because you need vehicles that can go through the water. All of this will be unpacked. There's no question that we can always improve ourselves. And we learned some lessons which we put into effect in Rita. We're continuing to look at the lessons learned as we go forward. I guess and we'll sort out exactly what, in hindsight, one would have done differently. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that overlooking the very, very difficult physical challenge, which under the best of circumstances would have caused tremendous problems, I think is being unfair to everybody involved in, because it was virtually impossible in some respects to move logistically people out or things in a rapid fashion. And so that's, we're going to have to look at that, obviously, in terms of lessons learned. I've not forgotten the second part of the question. If you remind me really quickly what it was.
The second part was
just... do we focus too much on terrorism? The answer is actually we don't. We actually are an all-hazards agency. And one of the things when we set our scenario out, our 15 kind of big scenarios that we want to plan for that are catastrophes, some of them are terrorism, some of them are pandemics like avian flu, which are not terrorism, and a lot of them obviously are terrorism related. And there's differences in the way you deal with each, but there's some overlaps. So we are definitely an all-hazard agency. What I will say is, of course, is sometimes public attention tends to focus on one or the other. And something that I have said over and over again, this is probably my parting thought, is the best discipline we can bring to the job of Homeland Security is always remember not to only fight the last battle. We have to learn lessons from the last battle, but we always have to be balanced across the board. In July, we talked a lot about subways. That's still important. We didn't talk a lot about subways in September. We talked a lot about hurricanes. That's still important. But aviation is still important too. Avian flu is still important. We have to look at applying our resources and our efforts across the board. And the only common theme that we've sounded from, certainly from my arrival here, and I think before, that's been throughout all the administration's policies, and it's got to be risk-based. We've got to look at where the threat is, what the vulnerability is, and where the consequences are. Implicit in that is the recognition we cannot protect everybody against everything at every moment in every place. We have to make choices. Catastrophes are in particular places where the federal government really has to add value and can help, but at all levels of government, because we are still basically in a country in which the first responders are state and locals. We have to be risk-based in what we focus on. There's always room for improvement. We will learn some lessons, and hopefully there'll be some redeeming things that come out of this exercise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to just close by saying two things. One, it is one of the proudest hallmarks of a democracy that our public officials are willing to come and not simply give us prepared speeches, but to answer questions, and hard questions. And for that, we thank Secretary Chertoff. The second is, I think, fitting for the end of the 75th anniversary kickoff. Woodrow Wilson, in many places, is best known for the League of Nations, at least for his vision, not for its implementation. But when you listen to Secretary Chertoff, I think you hear something quite different. I was very struck in your remarks by how often you referred to working with our allies and our partners, and what we really heard was at least the beginnings of a network of nations, which seems a very good way to reinterpret Woodrow Wilson 75 years, indeed 100 years on. With that, I thank you, and I thank all of you, and we are adjourned.